Joining me tonight is Kall, Director of Debate at the University of Michigan. Thanks for joining me, Aaron.
Great to be back with you.
So, by all accounts, this was a fiery, impassioned speech by the president. At moments, he was kind of going off script and getting into it with people in the crowd. How effective would you say he was tonight?
Yeah, I think it was a pretty solid effort overall. There were certainly a lot of high stakes coming into it, just kind of the start of the general election campaign, him not doing very well in national and battleground polls, and a lot of concern about his age. And I think that delivering the speech over an hour with a lot of energy and vigor might reduce some of the concerns about that. And yeah, I think the highlights of the speech where he really felt most comfortable was when he was mixing it up with those in the audience from the Republican Party that were jeering. And he's kind of a creature of the Senate, had been there for decades. Kind of saw something similar to this in the State of the Union address in 2023, and so he relished that opportunity to say why the proposals that he was supporting are popular and should be defended, and seemed to really enjoy those kind of exchanges, which is rare for a speech like this, but I think it was to his advantage.
Yeah, he did seem to be having fun with it. He didn't mention former President Trump by name, but there was plenty of my predecessor this, my predecessor that. Do you think he achieved his goal in really painting that stark contrast between him and his likely opponent in the election?
I think so. I think that was over about a dozen mentions of that, and everyone knows he's obviously talking about former President Trump, and yeah, he definitely doesn't want the 2024 election to be a referendum on his first term in office. There's a lot of weak spots, but more of a contrast with that and former President Trump, and so talking about his different positions on things like immigration and China, the economy, COVID, and other things. Really does set up that stark contrast. And now he's got 8 months to make that case. He's going to follow this speech up with hitting the campaign trail in some battleground states like Pennsylvania and Georgia. And so 1 hour speech is not likely going to make a huge difference. But if you combine that with some successful trips and help from surrogates, then that can maybe give some momentum to the fledgling campaign.
What'd you make of what he said about Gaza? Terrell's story just mentioned he announced the construction of this pier. He wanted more aid to be sent into Gaza. He called for a two-state solution over time. We also saw a very emotional reaction from Michigan Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Yeah, this is a very difficult position for him. No matter what he does, he's going to anger certain constituencies. I think he was hoping that there'd be a ceasefire before the address tonight. Obviously, that didn't happen, but he did talk about new measures. The language is definitely changing a little bit, kind of putting Israel on notice. But it's very important, not just Michigan, other states. You saw a large number of uncommitted voters in the Minnesota primary, and these states, these battleground states, especially Michigan, it was just decided by 10, 20,000 votes in 2016, 150,000 votes in 2020. And with that many uncommitted votes, that'd be very tough for him to win, and be unlikely to see him win re-election without a state like Michigan. So you just have to hope in the next 8 months, conditions on the ground change, and he has time before the actual election in November to change some of those minds and get them back in the fold. But if the election were held today, it'd be very tough for him.
And how about border security? He had the exchange with Marjorie Taylor Greene, held up the button that many Republicans were wearing out in the crowd, and really tried to point the finger at Republicans for killing that bipartisan deal last year. Do you think he was successful in trying to kind of shift that narrative?
I think that was one of the stronger parts of the speech. Clearly, in some ways, there's a lot of red meat that he's trying to get very partisan Democrats back in his corner, those maybe abandoned him after 2020. So there was a lot there on the economy and other things for them. But another big part of the speech is to try to get more moderate independent voters by pivoting a little bit more to the center, kind of like Bill Clinton in his 1996 State of the Union address. So that's an issue on immigration where he talked about increased enforcement and funding and maybe changing some of the asylum rules. And yeah, he was saying that this is something that passed the Senate and has the support, probably if it got to a vote would pass the House, but the Speaker of the House is not allowing that, and former President Trump has come out against it. And so it made the common sense case for it. And he also had help from Senator James Lankford, who's a Republican and was instrumental in those talks. He said that, that's true. He mouthed that during the speech to give him kind of cover, saying that his description of the immigration legislation was accurate. And so I'm not sure that that's, going to cause it to pass, but seemed, pretty reasonable and moderate on that, and probably something that many people do support. So I thought that was one of the more positive exchanges that he had when mixing it up with the Republicans on a very important issue that more and more voters care about, would show in the polls.
And before I let you go, how about Senator Katie Britt's response? It's traditionally a pretty tough job, a tough position to be in. How do you think she did?
Unfortunately, not very well. It's probably the toughest speech in all of politics. We've seen many others fail: Marco Rubio, Bobby Jindal, Kathleen Sebelius, and it's just so difficult to compete with the pomp and circumstance of the State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress, and you have a Republican senator, sitting in her home kitchen. Just a very difficult contrast. And you wanted the age contrast. She's much younger, and that played, but seemed kind of a little nervous, and just was going to be very new to a lot of people in politics. So I think, unfortunately, she's going to get maybe the Saturday Night Live treatment this weekend, and it'll be very difficult. But just there's not a lot of upside in this, and it didn't think that it was very effective. And just it's just so difficult to compete with the setting and all the advantages that an incumbent president has. And so it was very difficult to execute.
Sure. Aaron Kall, Director of Debate at the University of Michigan, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Appreciate your insight.
Anytime.